So for today, we have Alicia Zhang, who many of you have seen before. She's a PhD candidate in Earth and Environment who's been working with us for a few years now. And this is on a project that's a subset of the Corporate Carbon Risk Project that some of you have seen in the last couple of years of presentations. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Alicia.
Thanks, Susan. As Susan said, my name is Alicia Zhang. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Earth and Environment. And today I'll be talking about our research to model the timing achievement of electric generator retirement and additions. Some of you may have attended prior IMAP lunch seminars in which we talked about our carbon forward-looking work stream. In this project, our ultimate goal is to create this predictive model to see whether corporations will be able to meet the carbon target across industries. This subset of the research derives largely from that project. So the motivation is very similar. Of course, reductions of corporate carbon emissions is important, but not all carbon targets are necessarily being achieved. Certainly, investors care and should care about corporate carbon emissions because this talks about or provides a lot of information surrounding risk. And this risk can come in the form of financial penalties if they don't meet the mandatory targets or mandatory and voluntary targets. There might be some reputational implications if they don't meet their targets. Or, for example, if they don't meet the targets now, this might signal to investors in the future that they might not meet any of the future targets, which will only increase more regulations come into play, and as more strict regulations come into play. So in our prior research, we focused on the US electric utility sector. And we chose this sector for two reasons, which are closely related. One is that electric utilities are mandated to file certain data with their respective Department of Public Utilities, and they've done so for quite a few decades. So we have a lot of historic data available for this sector. And secondly, utilities also have to file what's called the Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP, which is basically like a 5 to 10 year investment plan of their stated planned actions to meet either load or to meet their targets. And so we have a lot of detail into what their planned actions are for the future. So we initially looked at 15 utility companies in the US, and we mapped their historic emissions, their future targets, past targets, and also looked at a variety of variables, including their stated planned actions in their integrated resource plans. And what we noticed is that a lot of utility companies that have generation services in their business model have tended to, in their planned action to meet the future carbon targets, have plans to retire fossil fuel assets and replace them by cleaner, renewable energy. And so the achievement of carbon targets is very much tied to this action, the retirement of fossil fuels and replacement with clean energy. And so that's where the shift of our focus for this research project, to turn to. However, of course, this action may not be always financially beneficial to either the energy asset owners as well as local communities whose economies revolve around these fossil fuel types, such as communities that have coal as their main source of economy. So we were also interested in the role of energy policies, which can help accelerate this transition that can create pressure and incentives on utilities to adopt renewable technologies. And they also have a bunch of other different benefits, including they diversify energy portfolios to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and minimize externalities related to these fossil fuels. They also create economies of scale that help alleviate the cost of renewable technologies. But of course, energy policy adoption is not random and it's very much influenced by the political environment of the state that initiates this energy policy. And here we're focusing on renewable portfolio standards, or RPS standards. So our research question for this project is, which energy assets are actually being retired or built on time? And what are the drivers that influence the achievability of these future retirements or additions? We collected the bulk of our information or our data from the US Energy Information Administration, or EIA. And we've compiled data from 2013 to 2022, just because these are the years that have the most complete data from the EIA. And their annual reports include whether the US utilities plans to either add or retire electric generation facilities, the anticipated completion date as reported by the utility, both the month and year of the project, the actual completion date in a separate data file, the field type, capacity, and location of the generation asset, particularly the unit of the generation asset. And the data sets reported years both include the new plans that are reported in that year, as well as all previously reported plans. So for example, if we're looking at a data sheet from 2015, that data sheet includes all the newly reported assets for 2015, as well as those that have been reported in 2014, 2015, so on. But in our analysis, we're looking at the actual project completion dates versus the first year in which the project was reported. So we did a lot of cleaning of this data to make sure that this was something. And so in all, we assessed 550 units that are planned for retirement, and then 4,481 units that are planned to be built. And we supplemented this data with information from Gallup survey at the National Conference of State Legislatures and the US Department of Treasury to look at some political and market factors, which I will talk about more in the next slide. So in all, we analyzed 110 variables, and we selected or categorized some of these variables based on both our preliminary analysis of the 15 electric utility companies, as well as some conversations with experts and practitioners in the field. And the three kind of categories that we came up with were the political environment, which includes states, political affiliation, and RPS type. These I will go into a bit more detail a little bit later on. Next, we have some market characteristics. And then lastly, the generation characteristics of the generation asset, which includes producer type, technology, these two different groupings, and then the capacity of the generation asset. So to go through them again in more detail, first we have states, which is pretty obvious, all 50 states plus DC. Something I want to note here is that all of these 51 variables are included in the 110 variables. The way that this entered into our data sheet is that if an asset, for example, was located in Alabama, that would get a score of 1. And for all the other states, since it can't be located in more than one state, would get a score of 0. And that's something that we had done for a lot of our other binary variables, including political affiliation, whether the state was Republican or Democratic leaning or moderate, so it gets a score of 1 and 0, and this information we got from the scale-up survey. The next variable is RPS status, whether it had no RPS, a voluntary or mandatory RPS. This is information that we got from the National Conference of State Legislatures. Market characteristics, there are a few continuous variables that we included, the years into completion, which is the difference between the first year that the asset was reported and the year that is anticipated for it to be completed. We have average retail price, a change in total retail sales, and change in population. We get a little bit more information about load and demand size. And then we have long-term interest rate and short-term interest rate to get a sense of the investment environment. Producer type are the electric utility, commercial, etc. And these are categories as defined by the EIA. These are all the technologies that the EIA lists. And of course, there are a lot of them, and a lot of them are very, very specific. Unfortunately, a lot of the data for some of the specific variables, there are not that many of them. As you can imagine, there are not many flywheels that are being added or retired as compared to something like a natural gas-fired combined combustion. And so due to the availability of the data, we group them into these different categories to have it be more statistically rigorous. So we have this first technology subgroup in which we combine them into natural gas, coal, petro, geothermal, etc. But then we have a much broader grouping, our main groupings, which is just simply fossil fuels versus eligible renewables, which is basically what the stated plan actions of the utilities are really looking at. And then last, we have the capacity in megawatt hours for each of the units of the generation assets, and we squared and log transform them just to meet some of the assumptions in our regression model. So our definition of achievement, we have a data set that has the reported planned actions in a data set with the actual completed assets that were built or retired. And so we cross-reference them based on their date, plant, and unit IDs. The difference in the months between the planned date and the actual date of the retirement or addition was recorded. And then any planned actions that appeared in the reported planned action, but not in the actual completed assets, were denoted as planned abandoned. So what we first did was just to create a distribution chart to see just when these assets were being added or retired and what their timing looked like. The x-axis is in months, and so as you can see, this is kind of big. A lot of these assets are being built around the 1 month or 0 month timeline, and then it kind of drops down a little bit to the 12-month or 1 year timeline. Something that's not included in this graph are all the abandoned plans, which are about 12,000 of them in the first iteration of this distribution graph. And so based on just the sizing of the assets that have been achieved around the 0 month timeline, and then all the abandoned plans, we wanted to make sure that each of the sample groups were large enough for some statistically rigorous regression modeling. And so we defined on time as being achieved within 1 year of the utility stated deadline. That is, if it was achieved prior to 12 months after its reported completion date, the 0 month mark, or in the negative, so it was completed before the utility had stated that it would be completed, that was something that we considered as on time. And anything that was completed after 12 months of the reported date or was an abandoned plan, that was something that we considered as not being completed on time.
So just to understand, so everything to the left, like 0 is where the high peak is, right?
Yes.
And everything to the left means they actually built it before the plan target date. Right?
Exactly, yes.
And there are some that are not here, which are the ones that were never completed during your sample period, and that's the 12,000.
Exactly, and the only reason why they're not on the chart is because it's the scaling of it is just so big. We did the same distribution for retirement, and we saw a very similar shape in the distribution chart, and so we again categorized them as on time or on time, depending on if they're within this 1 month threshold. And so the basis of our model is a logistic regression model because we have this binary outcome of either achieved on time or not achieved on time. And we use something called the automatic model selection technique, which is basically an optimization model that selects variables for regression by first formulating this general unrestricted model. So a model that includes all the 110 variables that we inputted and deletes the stepwise along different paths, making sure that it meets certain diagnostic requirements, including the significance level of 0.05, which is what we selected. But this is the significance levels for the global model, not for particular univariate relationships. And then if there was more than one terminal model result, the model with the lowest value on this chosen information criterion, which we use Schwartz, which is just the default, is selected. So the results look like this. It's quite complicated, but I will walk you through some of the examples. On the left-hand side, we have all the coefficient results for the retirement. And then on the right-hand side, we have all the coefficients and significant variables for additions. So as you can see under T-prob, that is the T-value for this univariate relation between, let's say, total retail sales and the achievement of a retired asset being achieved on time or not. So the T-prob for a bunch of them are under 0.05, but as you can see for Virginia, for example, the T-prob is 0.98, which is above the 0.05 threshold, but again, we're looking at the global significance in the model and not necessarily these univariate relationships. So turning towards the interpretation, we focus really on the direction of the coefficients, So the way that you can interpret, let's say, no RPS for retirements is that the assets located in the states without an RPS policy or no RPS are less likely because of the negative direction than any other state with an RPS policy to be completed on time.
So that's what you would expect,
Yes,
because the RPS standard is kind of intended to bring about more renewables. And
exactly.
that's kind of, and the way the RPS is acting, whether it's a financial fine or whether it's how it's implemented, does that matter? Or you're putting just RPS or no RPS as the criteria?
We have 3 variables. We have no RPS, and then we have a mandatory RPS, and then a voluntary RPS. And the mandatory one would be the one with financial penalties attached to it.
And what you call RPS is both the mandatory and voluntary.
Yes, just because both of them weren't found to be significant in this variable, I just categorized them in one, but it would be separated in the model. And so in regard to the magnitude of the coefficient, this is a little bit tricky in the context of this regression model. Because we're using a logistic regression model, it is a nonlinear regression. And so the interpretation of the coefficients, the magnitude of the coefficients isn't meaningful, because the interpretation, for example, of negative 1.66 would be that a 1 unit increase in no RPS, which doesn't make a lot of sense here, would lead to a decrease in 1.66 in terms of the log odd ratio. This can't really be interpreted in a meaningful way because it doesn't say much to the relative risk or the relative probability. The way to get that relative probability or relative risk is to calculate the marginal effects. But because this is a logit model, and again, it's nonlinear, the marginal effect is essentially like the slope of a line or the instantaneous change when you have a 1 unit increase in the independent variable, how that affects the dependent variable. But because a logit model is nonlinear, it's kind of like an S shape turned 90 degrees or a horizontal S-shaped curve. The slope of that line will differ depending on the value of the dependent variable, the x-axis. And so you can't calculate a marginal effect that would be meaningful for every single value or the range of values for that variable, but you can get the minimum, maximum, or average marginal effects, but then that wouldn't be meaningful when you're looking at the polar opposites of that spectrum or that range of the x variable values.
So, Alicia, just for everybody's sake there, how to interpret, sort of focus on the retirement side of things. So the way I think about this is that if there is no RPS in a certain state, somebody typically for utility sets a target, then the negative sign indicates it's less likely than the average to meet that target. So similarly, if it's a CHP, electric CHP plant, then it's more likely that it will meet the target, the plus sign for 3.86.
Yes, exactly. So
it's a Republican state, it's also more likely the 3.14.
yes, some of the variable results have been a little bit surprising. Some of them make sense. Like I think the technologies make sense, and some of the states make sense, and then some of the market characteristics make sense. But there are some variables in there that are opposite to what would be intuitive to us. Exactly.
And so, Alicia, is it correct to summarize what you were describing before in terms of it's hard to compare the absolute numbers across categories here? But within a category, for example, you have the states listed in order of numerical value, and that says, you know, additions were more likely to happen in New Mexico and Hawaii than they were in Vermont or Washington, right? Like the order is correct, but the magnitude you can't do until you get to your future slides that explain the equation that puts it all together.
Exactly, that's correct.
But this shows direction within each category of what matters and what doesn't.
Exactly, yes. And so just another example, looking at the technologies for additions, we have other gases, natural gas, compressed air storage, etc., that all have the positive direction of the coefficients, and that again would mean or be interpreted as that units that have these technologies are more likely than any others that are not found to be significant by the model to be added on time. So even though we can't look at the magnitude of the coefficients on the univariate basis, we can use these coefficients to predict the future plan's likelihood of an on-time completion. So we can use this equation on the left-hand side, which is x as a function of p, which is just the way that the logit model is set up and how we can transform it so that we get this probability. So to simplify it, we can use an example. So let's say we have a coal plant in Texas. What would be the likelihood of it being retired on time? So if we just pick a couple of the variables in this first column, say Texas coal change in total retail sales, etc., we can grab the coefficients from the last slide, negative 1.33 for Texas, 0 for coal because it was not found to be significant in the model, etc. We can and multiply that by the actual value, which is, yes, it is in Texas, so it gets a score of 1. Yes, it is a coal asset, it gets a score of 1. The change in total retail sales for that year is 0.05, etc. And we sum up those products of the coefficient multiplied by the data value, we get the log likelihood at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. We insert that log likelihood and put it into this function. We can get this probability of 99% of the likelihood that the coal plant in Texas would retire on time. And of course, this is just like a hypothetical number because we're just using so few variables. It would be something different once we have like an actual plant with all these other variables that we considered.
So this is kind of the use of the model within your sample.
It's the use of the model within the sample, and also if you use it the predictive model. It's just showing how we can use the coefficients to create this probability.
Right, but outside of your sample, you may not have some of these variables.
Exactly. Yes. So we did do an in-sample modeling technique just to look at how well our model predicts the achievability of each asset by using the model results to predict the achievability based on the assets that have already been retired or built in our historic data set. So we did this by a remove and replace technique. So let's say we have a data set of 100 observations. We remove that first observation, run a logit model on the data values of all 99 other observations. Given the significant variables from the automatic model selections, where we know which variables are significant, extract those coefficients from that model run on the 99 observations, and then multiply those coefficients, or basically do the calculation from the previous slide on that removed observation, and get a probability of the achievement of that removed observation, and then compare that with what was actually the actual achievement of the removed observation. And we iterated that through all 100 of those observations. Of course, the number is different based on our sample size. And so what we have on the left-hand side are the results for the retirements. On the y-axis is the probability of the asset being retired on time as reported or calculated by this model. And on the x-axis is the actual achievement. So it was either achieved on time or not achieved on time. The probability, the median probability that was spitted out by this model for those that were achieved on time was about like 85, 86%, versus its probability of assets being achieved on time was about 40% for those that were actually not achieved on time. And similarly for additions, we have the model giving out this probability that about 65 or 70% of the assets are being built on time, and those were actually built on time, versus like 55% for those that were not achieved on time. And so there is this difference between what the model expects the achievability of the assets would be versus like what it actually does in actuality.
So would you conclude something about how good your model is from this, or is it, what would you do with this?
I would say the difference between, or I guess, in other words, like the accuracy of the model seems to suggest that it's a good fit just because there is this big difference between. Yes. So then we applied our model to look at the reported assets that were going to be retired in the future or added in the future. So as Nolan pointed out earlier, some of these variables we don't necessarily have because they're like forecasts in the future, which includes like long-term interest rate. We don't necessarily know what the long-term interest rate would be, let's say 2030, although there are models across different disciplines that may provide that value. In my discipline as a social sciences, I just took the maximum, minimum, and average, and of course the other researchers in other disciplines might use a different model to impute or predict that value. But the black line represents what would be the probability of achievements just based on this average long-term interest rates. And then we also have these kind of faded blue lines that represent the maximum and minimum interest rates as variable inputs. So as we can see, the general trend is that there's this gradual decrease in the probability that an asset will be retired on time, although there is this big hump around 2027. This may be explained just by the amount of plans that are reported for the future. There are a lot in the near future from 2023 to 2027, but after that, a number of reported plans just start to diminish. And so when we're looking at the average probability across each of these bars, one plan just would have like a greater impact on the average of that sample than something that has a larger sample in the set. And so the 2027 can just be an outlier just based on like the sample size for that period.
So in general, even if you look at, so let's take the 2025 number. So it says that there's only somewhere little higher than a 30% chance that a plan that calls for, this is adding to regression assets, right? Or is it both? Additions, yeah. If a utility says that they will add a plan in 2025, you only can put a 35% probability that it will actually happen.
Exactly.
In that year.
In that year.
Mm-hmm.
So this is adding what kind of things?
It's any kind of plants. It could be a fossil fuel-based plant, it could be a renewable technology plant.
But then the previous ones were saying that depending on which type of plant it is, there'll be variation within that. But I think you're showing like the
average across all of them. Yeah.
So
Sorry.
I was going to say, to answer that question, which is if it is a coal plant, a natural gas plant or retiring coal plant, you can answer that question as well.
Yes, given all the other variables that are associated with that unit, but if it's an asset that has a variable that was not found to be significant by the model, the coefficient would just be 0, and so it would have like a very low probability.
We'll have the probability based on the state it's located in and whether it's an RPS and all of those sorts of things. It's just the technology would influence its likelihood. It's the other factors that influence the likelihood. At the moment, for some technologies are found to not play a role in being more or less likely to happen on time. And then in some cases, it's the state or other factors that are significant.
So in the previous slide, we were talking about the additions. We can just go for a second. These, for example, the requirements, when you say achieve on time, that's by the model. And then the next one, not achieve on time, that's also by your model, or this is the actual not achieved on time?
Those are the actual achieved on time. What this model does is it just tests whether our particular model really works. And so we use the model on historic data that we already know whether the asset has been achieved on time or not. And we're just like testing to see what the model predicts what those assets achievability would be. Whereas in the later slides, we're using the model on assets that we don't know their outcome just because they're set to be completed in the future.
But the answers to the first retirement is all model results right now? Or one is model, one is actual?
She took the actuals, well, every actual thing that we know whether it happened or not, and split them into two groups within the retirements box. So the left-hand side are the ones that we know actually happened, and the right-hand side are the ones that did not happen on time. And then actual, yeah,
So
so
they
like the
are-
left versus right within each box is really what happened. And then the vertical y-axis is what probability the model assigned to that actual thing having happened. So the model said for most things that really did happen on time, it gave up like a 95% likelihood. But the model had those dots at the bottom are the specific examples that really did happen on time, but the model thought were not gonna happen. It only gave like a 10% likelihood to some of those projects that actually happened on time.
What we should be focusing on the left-hand panel on the retirements. And on the retirements, the left one, the dots that are on the bottom part of this graph. Those are the ones that the
Model got wrong.
model got wrong.
Mhm.
And what the things that model got right are where? Are those dots in the shaded part up on the top in the box?
Well, I think, yeah, that would depend on where you would consider like the threshold of what the probability would have to be in order for it to be
Yeah.
considered right. But the bolded black line is like the median across all the probabilities. And then there's like a first quartile and the third quartile, which are the edges of the box. And so what I'm really looking at is just that bolded black line, which just shows like the average or the median across all of the different assets that are being inputted into the model.
So,
It is a box plot, but with additional information of all the outliers, so to speak, on the box.
also, yeah, right?
They are achieved, they have achieved, or they have achieved on time, but model said, yeah, I
May not
don't
have-
think they did, but they did.
I see. I see. And the reverse of the model says it will achieve, but it did not achieve. There are no such dots on the right-hand panel.
Right. Well, that's maybe because
The
dash
box is
bar,
very wide.
the box is taller there. But I think your model is stronger on retirements than additions, if I interpret this correctly, because on retirements, it's saying, 95% of the time, it thought things that actually happened on time were gonna happen on time. So mostly the model's saying, yes, I assign a 95% probability to the things that we know, because we have the crystal ball of the past, that they really happened. And on the ones that failed to happen on time, your model said only about 40% of those would happen on time. So the model was pretty good at differentiating between what would happen and what would not happen on retirements. On additions, it was also, able to differentiate, but it's less so. The differentiation between which projects would be added on time and wouldn't is not as clear on the additions as it is on the retirements that are spread further. So
That's right, yes.
So on additions, I assume that the additions just mean something better than what it was before. In other words, if it's a coal plant, the addition is not going to be another coal plant, or it's going to be something cleaner. It could
not
be-
necessarily.
Not
Not
necessarily.
necessarily.
No.
So.
She doesn't do that, I think, right? You don't ask what it's replacing.
Yeah, that's correct, yes. And so this model kind of combined all the different field types into one graph.
So-
This slide is just the same probability graph looking at retirements. So again, we see this kind of overall trend of this decrease in probability over time of the asset being retired on time. Again, we see this blip in 2028, but that could be due to some outliers.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what I said. So you're saying that if a utility says in 2030 you're going to retire something, you think it's a very low probability it's actually do that?
Yes. So there are three kind of conclusions or takeaways for our analysis so far. The first is that there are many variables that we expected to be included in the predictive model that are including some of the technology types and some of the states and like the RPS statuses, but there were also some variables that we would have expected to be in the model that were included, such as some of the very specific types of technology, such as, let's say, solar. I would have expected that to be included significant in like the additions model, but it was not included. or something like coal or petrol, which we included in the retirements model, but it was not included. The second takeaway is that the in-sample modeling seems to demonstrate that the model is a good predictor just based on the data that we have available. And the third takeaway is that based on the last two probability graphs, that more distant targets have a lower probability of being achieved on time.